In this video, we'll discuss stereotypes and discrimination based on weight. We'll define terms such as lookism and weightism, and we'll specifically explore how weight-based discrimination affects people in several different contexts. For example, in relationships, in school, at work, and in the healthcare system. Alice Eagley, who we've seen before, and her colleagues conducted a meta-analysis of 76 studies on what we call the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype, and found that overall, physically attractive people were evaluated more positively than were physically unattractive people. Physical attractiveness had a very strong influence on judgments of social competence, for example, but very little influence on judgments of how much concern the person had for others and of the person's integrity. The overall interpretation here is that physical attractiveness does have a big impact, but it's more likely to affect people's perceived popularity and sociability rather than their perceived morality. As is already apparent from this stereotype, the "what is beautiful is good" stereotype, there are tangible benefits to being physically attractive, and we call this lookism. Lookism refers to the positive stereotypes, the preferential treatment, and so on that's given to physically attractive people, and the opposite for physically unattractive people. For example, one study showed that physically attractive people tend to have more friends and a more active sex life than physically unattractive people, and many studies show that being physically attractive leads to economic advantages. In 2011, for example, Hammermesh concluded that people of above average attractiveness earn between 10 and 15% more than their peers who are doing the same work but are of below average attractiveness. And this is a big difference, right? This results in as much as $230,000 in lifetime earnings. Hammermesh also concluded that based on the available evidence, that's a cross-cultural effect. It's not something just exclusive to the United States. Similarly, a study in 2014 showed that the earnings of men in their mid-30s to early 50s had earnings that could be predicted from how attractive their high school yearbook pictures were rated to be. Each standard deviation unit increase in youthful attractiveness, for example, based on independent ratings of their yearbook pictures, resulted in up to 3.3 percentage points higher income later in life, even when other factors that might affect income, like age and education, were taken into account statistically. And as a final example, appearance can also affect how people's work performance is viewed. Marcus Mobius and Tanya Rosenblatt in 2006 gave Argentine undergraduates the chance to earn points by solving maze puzzles. Prior to completing the puzzles, participants were photographed, and independent raters categorized the images on a 5-point scale ranging from plain to attractive, so sort of an attractiveness scale. And as expected, actual performance on the maze was unrelated to the worker's physical appearance. We have no reason to think that how attractive you are would influence how well you do at this maze. But attractive workers still received what they referred to as a beauty premium. Undergraduates who played the role of employer awarded them higher wages than their less attractive counterparts, even though they were doing the same work and the same quality of work. Now, closely related to lookism, we have anti-fat bias and weightism. Anti-fat bias is a very broad term encompassing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and you'll see aspects of that in this definition. It's a negative attitude toward, a belief about, or behavior against people who are perceived as being overweight. Weightism refers specifically to the discrimination part of anti-fat bias, discrimination against people based on their weight. And just to be really clear, how do lookism and these terms like weightism differ? Lookism is more general and relates to physical attractiveness, whereas anti-fat bias and weightism, these terms here, refer specifically to weight. So you can be thin and unattractive, just like you can be overweight and attractive. Lookism then depends sort of on physical attractiveness regardless of weight, whereas these terms here relate specifically to beliefs and behavior toward people who are overweight and obese. So what do we have in terms of stereotypes? Stereotypes about fat people include their being lazy, sloppy, unattractive, unhappy, sad, and powerless. And these are some older references, but they hold up in present research today. Based on these negative beliefs, we have pervasive weight-based discrimination that emerges in people's interpersonal relationships, their employment and education settings, and in the healthcare system. And we'll talk about all of these different sectors in just a little bit. And in all these areas, we find that discrimination worsens as weight increases. So discrimination increases or worsens as weight does as well. So there's a positive correlation there. Interestingly, research shows that people are generally unconcerned about appearing prejudiced against people who are overweight, and this suggests that this bias is rooted in culturally accepted values. For example, research shows that anti-fat bias is perceived as being more socially acceptable than bias based on race, based on gender, or based on sexual orientation. But despite these beliefs, weight-based stigma is unlikely to motivate people to lose weight. Instead, overweight people who internalize anti-fat bias report that they're less likely to diet and they're more likely to engage in binge eating than those who do not internalize this bias, and that's a study from 2007. In another study, for example, women who perceived themselves to be overweight consumed more calories and reported a lower ability to control their diet after reading a news article about weight-based job discrimination compared to a group of women who read a news article about job discrimination against smokers, something unrelated to weight. Moreover, the experience of weight-based stigma has a strong positive correlation with self-reported avoidance of exercise. So it seems to have the opposite effect. And finally, another study in 2013 examined weight changes in a represented sample of Americans, who were over the age of 50, some of whom were obese and some of whom were not. Those who were initially not obese but reported experiencing weight-based discrimination, for example, for being slightly overweight, were 2.5 times more likely to be obese 4 years later than were people who did not report weight-based discrimination. Those who were initially obese were more likely to remain so if they reported experiencing weight-based discrimination, whereas other types of discrimination did not affect future weight. So the results are clear, right? Discriminating against somebody because of their weight, having anti-fat bias, is just going to have a negative effect on those people. It's not going to motivate them to lose weight. That doesn't work. Now, there are racial and ethnic differences here. In a study of 389 adult women, all women, regardless of their race and ethnicity, wanted to weigh less than they did, which is already sad. But important for racial ethnic differences, the results showed more body dissatisfaction and at a significantly lower weight for white women compared to Black or Hispanic women. And white women had this terrible body dissatisfaction at a weight on average that, technically speaking, is not even considered overweight. And as we've already seen, there are also gender differences here, and I've referred to women several times already. And specifically what we find is that physical attractiveness is perceived to be more important than females than for males, and there's much more of an emphasis on weight. That's not to say that men don't face issues or boys don't face issues in regards to weight and weight-based discrimination, but it seems to be more of an emphasis, more of a focus, even more of a problem for women and girls. Ficken and Rothblum in 2012, for example, reviewed the literature on weight bias, and they concluded that overweight women are stigmatized more than overweight men in romantic relationships, as well as in employment, in healthcare, and in mental health settings. And this gender difference in judgment begins in childhood, as I kind of referred to. Penny and Haddock in 2007, for example, showed that children evaluate overweight girls more negatively than average weight girls, but the evaluations of boys were not affected by their weight. And again, just to reemphasize, these sorts of results don't mean that overweight males don't face discrimination, but rather it's just that weight and attractiveness are more of a focus for females than for males in our culture. Let's briefly discuss a few studies that explored weightism in some of the different settings I've hinted at throughout this video. In one study, for example, male students spoke to a girl on the phone. The girl was an actor, a Confederate, right, undercover experimenter, and it was the same for all participants regardless of the condition. But in one condition, the profile picture showed an obese female, whereas in the other condition, the profile picture was a female with normal weight. And these right here weren't the actual photos, I just got those off Google. Participants were asked to rate the female's personality, including other things like how sociable, happy, enthusiastic, socially skilled, kind, outgoing, active, and warm, all sorts of things that their conversation partners were. And they were also asked to rate how much they liked their conversation partner, so just an overall rating, and finally to what extent they would like to have future interactions with them, and how much they would like to go out with them. So basically an overall assessment of this person. And what we found in this study was that in condition A, men across the board rated their conversation partner's personality as more negative, and they disliked her more than in condition B. In one study, researchers put out a fake personal ad, one way that people used to get together before the days of OkCupid and Tinder, or whatever else people are using nowadays, and they had two conditions. In one condition, the woman, again, not a real woman here, this is just an experiment, but it was put out in actual newspapers. In this condition, the woman noted in her general description in the ad that she was 50 pounds overweight. In the second condition, the woman noted that she had a history of substance abuse. So everything else about the ad was the same, but just this one little statement. And the results showed that the second woman received significantly more responses from men than the first, meaning that men in this naturalistic context, right, they didn't know they were in a study, were more interested in pursuing a romantic relationship with a woman who had a history of substance abuse problems rather than a woman who was overweight. And what about work? In another more recent study that employed a similar methodology, researchers submitted application materials for actual job openings. The materials were matched in every way except for the weight of the applicant, which was experimentally manipulated, again, by a photograph that was attached to the applications. One set of applications had a photograph of an overweight female, whereas the second set of applications had a photograph of a normal weight female attached. And the results showed, again, as you can probably predict by now, a strong bias against offering interviews to obese relative to normal weight job applicants. And moreover, this bias was predicted by employer scores on an implicit association test, or IAT, measuring anti-fat bias. And we also see the effects of weightism in academic settings. A study of 383 eighth graders and over 1,000 community college and university students measured students' BMI, their body mass index, their grades, and their intelligence, and they found that obese students received significantly lower grades in middle school, in community college, and in university, but they found no statistically significant differences in intelligence or achievement scores. Now, why would this be the case? Why are we seeing lower grades for people who are obese but not lower intelligence, right? Presumably because of weightism, right? Which can arise in many different forms and impact students in many different ways. For example, teachers may perceive these students as lazy, we saw that stereotype earlier, and so evaluate their work more negatively. Or these students themselves may feel more anxious or whatever, and they may disengage from school altogether. We see that heavier students, especially female students, are less likely to attend college than their average weight peers. And what about after college? After completing an in-person interview for graduate school programs, applicants with higher body weights, and especially females, again, were less likely to be accepted into that graduate program in a 2013 study. And we also find evidence of widespread weightism in healthcare settings. A 2013 study, different from the last one, for example, showed that physicians build less rapport with obese patients, which is important because good relationships between patients and practitioners has been shown to lead to more positive health outcomes. And consistent with these findings, healthcare professionals also show anti-fat and pro-thin biases, and studies as recent as 2015 show that this has not changed significantly over time. As we've already seen evidence of in other settings, gender biases persist here as well. For example, studies showed that physicians are more likely to recommend weight loss treatments for females than for males of the same weight. And finally, there's evidence for poorer treatment for obese compared to normal weight people. A study in 2012 showed that obese patients are less likely to be screened for cancer, and especially obese females. Let's talk about weightism by association, and I'll define what I mean by that in just a minute. You'll see what I mean based on the study. In this study, participants were simply shown a resume of a normal weight man along with a photo of that man. In one condition, the normal weight man was seated next to a thin woman, but in the second condition, the normal weight man was seated next to an overweight woman. The results showed that participants rated the man as having lower professional qualifications and interpersonal skills when he appeared with an overweight woman compared to when he appeared with a thin woman. We call this weightism by association because the man is being discriminated against because of his association with an obese female, or an overweight female, even though he himself is not overweight. And interestingly, the researchers found the same pattern of results in a follow-up study looking at race. For example, being seated next to a black man versus another white man significantly impacts how people rate your qualifications for a position. Now, as a final topic here, directly relevant to weightism is the idea of perceived controllability. Perceived controllability refers to assumptions about who is responsible for the attribute, the status, or the condition. And basically, perceived controllability asks the question of whether this could have been avoided. For example, things such as race and ethnicity and blindness are typically viewed as being uncontrollable, whereas things such as addictions and weight and mental illness are, often erroneously, viewed as being more controllable. Now, I want to emphasize again that these assumptions are often incorrect, but nonetheless people have them, and they can influence how people treat other people with these attributes, statuses, or conditions. For example, controllable, quote-unquote, things such as weight are often associated with blaming the person, kind of like victim blaming, and as a result, we see more negative emotions and more prejudice toward those groups. As an example of this, outside the realm of weight, but the same sort of findings apply, in a classic study, participants read a scenario about a man who had contracted AIDS due to one of four things. First, from an AIDS-infected homosexual partner. Second, from an AIDS-infected heterosexual partner. Third, from a blood transfusion. And fourth, from an AIDS-infected intravenous drug needle. Participants' pity and anger toward and willingness to help the AIDS-infected individual were then measured, and the results indicated that pity was a crucial mediator of helpful intentions toward an individual with AIDS. That is, to offer help to a person with AIDS, one is likely to first have to feel pity toward him or her. And compassionate feelings like pity or sympathy, in turn, were produced by beliefs that AIDS was contracted in an uncontrollable manner, for example, through a blood transfusion. Participants' perceptions that an AIDS infection could have been prevented, such as in the homosexual and drug use scenarios, produced anger toward the AIDS victim and an unwillingness to help him or her. And you see from a straight partner condition, that was viewed as controllable, but they didn't have these sort of overtly negative feelings and an unwillingness to help in the same way, because getting this from a straight partner is a little bit more culturally accepted.